So you got to imagine, it's been years since you've played the game. Your old LGS shut down, you've moved, life got busy, it's the classic story. But still in your head, and you watch some videos, follow the latest modern decks, and think nostalgically of your cube, sadly dusty in storage and out of date. So when relaxing at my favorite beer garden last week, I started paying attention when the group next to me broke out that familiar white rectangular box of cards and began counting to 15. And we started chatting. I think they could really read the interest on my face because almost immediately they invited me to hop in on the cube draft. It was a super friendly, fun group, old cards, new cards, played a couple of matches, talked about cubes, learned about an LGS in the area, and already keen on more cube drafts in the future. An unexpected evening really can't get much better than that, and as Anthony put it, that story is everything that's great about the game.
Hi everybody, it's Andy from this podcast. Before we dive into this week's episode, I wanted to let you know that this is your last chance to buy a pass for CubeCon this October. Passes will only be on sale until September 4th at midnight Central Time. So if you're interested in coming to Wisconsin this October to play some Cube with Anthony and I and a couple hundred of your new closest friends, make sure to go to mtgcubecon.com and click the link to buy a badge. We'll see you there. Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I am your host, Andy. I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony. Amulet Titan Maddox? I'm trying to think of what deck you would play in Modern if you were to play a deck. And I think my number one contender is Amulet Titan. My number two, maybe Yawgmoth?
I mean, Soul Sisters is still a thing, right?
No,
right?
It's absolutely not.
It's been a thing for 5 years, probably.
In Amulet Titan, you get to play the Ravnica bounce lands in
I do
Modern.
I do love those lands.
Make just a ridiculous amount of mana. You also get to play kind of like a toolbox suite of lands, kill people with Kessig Wolf Run.
I love that. Bajuka Bog, all kinds of cool stuff.
So you think that's what it would be? Amulet Titan?
Sure. I mean, the list of Modern decks that I'm familiar with is small.
Well, the other one is like a Yawgmoth Undying combo deck.
Actually,
basically.
I like that one a little bit more because I am a big fan of Yawgmoth.
Okay.
Seems like fun.
Toss up. Those are the two you can test out to decide which one you're going to play. I'm asking you, Anthony, what Modern deck you would play because we are not alone in this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. We are joined by SCG Open, 3-time SCG Open winner. I was trying to find your results online, and I couldn't actually confirm. I think you've won 3 SCG Opens, a couple SCG Classics. That's right. We are joined by an actual good Magic player on Lucky Paper Radio. It's Dom Harvey.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me. I think there used to be a leaderboard online somewhere at some point, but that has been lost to the archives by now.
The best I could find was there was like a results page on MTG Goldfish, which also had like every single online event you've ever participated in. It seems like it had like just pages and pages and pages of results, and I had to find the ones that mattered.
Well, the thing about that is, depending on how the TO decides to enter, you can be under one of any number of different names. So there's a Dom Harvey results page, and I think also a Dominic Harvey results page, and then my Magic Online screen name, and it's all scattered throughout the internet. But I think Anthony would enjoy Yawgmoth in Modern and Amulet too, and as someone whose entire personality essentially is having played Amulet Titan for a long time, then I will gladly welcome Anthony into the fold.
That's not your entire personality, because I didn't even know that, and so I feel like you definitely have a lot more depth to you than just playing Amulet Titan.
So I'm told. I will. I will take that to the bank.
So Dom is in town for SCG Baltimore this weekend, which has concluded. Also played some Cube because you got to play some Cube while you're in town in Baltimore. And we're going to start off with the Pack One Pick One from at least the most up to date version of your Cube list that's on Cube Cobra. You said this is maybe not exactly match the Cube you brought this weekend.
Yeah, my level of organization when it comes to keeping an up-to-date list on Cube Cobra really needs some working on, but
I disagree. It doesn't need some working on. I think it's like very freeing to just not have to be obsessive about organizing things. I think it's a flaw of mine that I actually can't change my cube on Cube Cobra unless I change it in paper because I have like a minor mental breakdown.
On a serious note, I do think that I have an unhealthy level of perfectionism when it comes to thinking about my own cubes and refining them, and I'll put a sketch up on Cube Cobra that I feel kind of satisfied with, and I'll do a few drafts and just scrap the whole thing and start from scratch again. And then when I actually get to draft in paper, which is not that frequently, and I think this is where some of that comes in, then I just have a big box of cards which roughly resembles the online list, and we crack it open and we draft it, and people seem pretty happy for the most part. So
turns out Magic is a fun game.
Totally always say Cube is just fun. You can you don't have to be a perfectionist about it to have fun. If you want to be a perfectionist about it because it's fun for you, which is how it is for me, and maybe for you too, Dom, then you can. But You can just play with magic cards. It's just fun.
And that's why, to go back to a theme that you guys have touched on the show repeatedly, is if you're looking to get into Cube, it seems like a pretty daunting process from the outside, especially if someone who came to one of your Cube nights for the first time, they're drafting a Cube and they're thinking, how do you go about making this whole vision for this thing and then getting it together and so on? Honestly, the best place to start is to just build a cube, and then people will probably have a good time. Like, it's hard to go wrong for the most part, and then you can iterate on that over time. And that's also the other joy of Cube, is that it's never complete. There's always more you can do, and if you get it to a point where it's the platonic ideal of your cube and you're happy with it, perfect, right? You can just keep that in the
that right in the show.
How many times have you seen that happen?
If you've done that right in, so we can figure out who you are and what's wrong with you, because I'd never known anybody that's actually finished their cube. I always think about DSB, who has the Old Border cube, which, save for the Time Spiral remastered Old Border reprints or whatever, hadn't gotten new cards in 20 years, and still DSB is updating this cube most weeks, I would say, and making changes to it. And that really shows you how much design space there is, even in a very limited card pool that is essentially unchanging for a very long time.
There was someone on the Riptide Lab forums who they had this long, extensive thread, well documented, devoted to updating this cube over time. And then at one point they said, okay, I think my work here is done. And then they just left and we haven't seen them again. So I really respect that.
Wow.
I wish I could become that person myself someday.
Wow. Yeah, I guess that's how...
All right, so it counts at 1.
I guess if I ever get tired of Magic, I won't admit that I'm tired of Magic. I'll just be like, yeah, I feel like I finished my cube, so I'm just going to, pack it up. Anyway, we're going to dive into this Pack 1 Pick 1 from Dom's Cube, which we will link in the show notes. So Dom, people will see this cube on Cube Cobra, whether you want them to or not. I'll read the pack, and then we'll go to Anthony first, see what Anthony thinks about it, and then Dom can tell us what he's taking out of this pack. Anyway, the pack is Young Pyromancer, Vindicate, Misty Rainforest, Slaughter Pact, Blood Crypt, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, Yorion Sky Nomad, Grim Lavamancer, Hallowed Fountain, Scavenging Ooze, Flesh Carver, Skull Clamp, Dam, Lazier Goblin, and Discovery Dispersal. Anthony?
Couple things stand out to me here. I think...
Can someone make a supercut of Anthony saying couple things stand out to me here week?
Please don't. Misty Rainforest, obviously fetch lands are very strong. I think I'm just starting there, but the other two cards that are standing out to me are Skull Clamp and Young Pyromancer. I'm not sure if either of those bump out Misty Rainforest for me, though.
Misty Rainforest seems like the safe pick to me as well. Skull Clamp, I think many people would say, is significantly better than a fetch land. I honestly don't know how I feel about it these days. I sometimes feel like it is much too slow in my environment to actually really be worth it. And there's a lot of decks where if you haven't really built around it more concretely, it's kind of not as great. So I'm between those two. I'm not going to take Young Pyromancer first as much as I like it. I feel like that's kind of forcing the Spellslinger thing. I do want to give a small shout out to Lazier Goblin. This is like a shock variant, essentially. It's a creature that ETBs and deals 2 to a target, and then you can pay 5 mana later or something to make it able to attack or block, which is a cool way to do a shock variant in the Mystery Booster playtest cards. But Dom, what are you taking?
I kind of like this as a sample pack because it's a lot of the familiar bread and butter effects that you would see in a lot of different cubes, and then also a hint that there's some weirder stuff going on. As you
Slaughter
see,
Pact is a little bit interesting.
We can come back to that one actually, because I think that should be in more normal cubes. But the Nykthos, for example, Yorion, and some of the other stuff there. So I like it as a kind of representative introduction, if you like. I think that Skull Clamp, I mean, it's one of the most busted Magic cards, one of the most horrific design mistakes of all time.
It's really pretty egregious.
Banned in basically every format that it was once legal in. As Andy said, though, I don't know how obnoxious it really is in a cube environment these days.
I don't either. I can't. I was playing against it just last night, and I was like, okay, yeah, it's fine. Like, I'm not worried about that. You draw some cards, whatever. I'll just bounce your creature you equip it to, or, I mean...
This is a spicy take.
Well, I mean, it obviously has this reputation from Constructed, because it is truly egregious in Constructed Magic and should never have been printed. And in any kind of like slow or value-oriented limited format, it would also be totally broken. But in a faster environment, it is a card, the Skull Clamp itself, the creature you sacrifice, and 2 mana to be neutral on cards. Now you are back where you started. You spent a card, you spent another card, you drew 2 cards.
But you took a lot of game actions.
You did take a lot of game actions, but it's not until you draw that, you sacrifice that second creature with a Skull Clamp on it, that you're actually up on cards. And even then, you're only up on 1 card because you're still down a creature and to go up on 2 cards. So in terms of raw card advantage, I think in a faster environment, it can be a liability.
Yeah, I think the goal really is to mess with that math by doing something like creating several tokens with 1 card and then just progressively feeding those to the Skull Clamp and replenishing your whole hand. And that can happen, but it takes some time, it takes some setup, and that's kind of where I want the card to be, as opposed to where it was in Constructed, where it's just this busted combo engine that runs away with the game. And so I think nowadays Skullclamp has come down from a horrific mistake on the level of, I guess, Oko would be the equivalent, or something ridiculous like
Companions.
that. Yeah, and it's more on that in a second, I suppose. And it's come back down to this point where it actually feels like a healthy but aspirational cube card, if that makes sense.
It feels like a build around to me. Like it doesn't feel like I just jam this in any deck with creatures and I'm thrilled. It feels like it's middling passable in like a normal deck, and then if you put it in a deck where you do have your Bitter Blossom or some Planeswalker spitting out 1/1 tokens or something, then it does get pretty scary. But like I said, I agree with you. That's where I want my Skullclamp to be as well. I want it to be a committal card that makes you change your draft picks in order to get the most out of it.
And this is in a format that has enough stuff cluttering up the board. It's easy enough to flood the board with 1/1s that this is one of the many reasons that I moved away from the kind of a mono Savannah Lion school of aggro, is that those cards just have a hard time getting through in my format, to the point where a card like Ragavan, which maybe is higher on power level than the kind of baseline for the format, doesn't feel that obnoxious because you actually have to put some work in to get that one through.
I catch so much shit on this show for saying that Ragavan is actually not obnoxious in my cube because, again, that card, it Constructed, has warped just about every format it's present in for a good reason. It is a ridiculous series of words to put on a 1-drop. It's just way too many effects, way too much going on, but it's still a 2/1. So I feel the same way, that dies to anything, gets blocked by anything, and I
saw that on the other side of the table last night, and how are you feeling about it?
Me? Oh, totally fine.
You were feeling fine? Okay.
Ragavan,
right, just want to check in.
Ragavan not a problem at all for me last night.
And then you got attacked to death by Ruffalos.
I did get killed by Ruffalos last night instead, so I guess Ruffalos is scarier than Ragavan as an attacker. You heard it here first. No, the Ragavan was not a problem last night. I dealt with it handily and felt my feeling was reinforced.
Having played your cube now in person, I see where you're coming from, in the sense that in your cube, almost every deck has a lot of stuff to do on the first turn, on the second turn. I don't think I ever untapped with the Mother of Runes against Anthony. It got murdered by about...
You can't allow that. And then I still lost to everything else you had, but that's my small victory.
Yeah, it got
I lost to the Mother of Runes, so there's all cyclical.
Yeah, it got disfigured in one game and Fatal Push in another game, and there may have been another removal spell as well, and there's Cut Down coming down the pipeline in a month or two. So in a format like that, where Ragavan is meeting a grisly fate some way or another, or it's getting blocked and dying in combat a lot of the time, that feels fine. But there are definitely formats where a turn on Ragavan would just strike fear into the hearts of whoever's on the other side.
Yeah, and I want to have an environment where you should expect to have to answer a turn 1 threat, right? I don't want a deck that can just sit there and essentially do nothing for the first 3 or 4 turns and be fine most of the time. So I'm happy to be in that spot. And I'm also happy that a much better and more experienced Magic player has backed me up a little bit, so I can maybe stop getting tweets about how my take on Ragavan is too spicy.
Oh, I am not afraid of mixing it up with people on Twitter, so just send them my way and we'll get the virtual fisticuffs in. But going back to this pack, I guess the stretch goal for me would be the Yorion, where if this is pack 1, pick 1, then I can take this, hope to build around it, and in my cube we operate with the original companion rule, where we're not nerfing it for Constructed, which I think was kind of a lost cause in the first place anyway. We're playing it as written, I suppose. And so if you want to chase that goal, then I think it is worth chasing, and it really warmed my heart in the draft that we all did on Friday, where all 3 of the companions in my cube, Lurrus, Yorion, and even the Gyruda, all were companions in their respective decks.
As well.
Yeah. I don't know if that was a smart choice on the part of the player who did it, but I love the choice, and I'm glad that someone felt the ability to dive down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I know it was Parker that ended up companioning that Yorion. I got to recount his incredible loop of Baral plus Forbid plus Life from the Loam, which was not a loop I'd ever thought of doing before.
It's not a loop I had ever thought of doing before, and that's a joy, right? Of this kind of emergent gameplay that you can find in your own cube sometimes. I looked over and Parker just had the opponent locked out of the game on turn 3, essentially, with this weird Rube Goldberg machine that he disassembled.
Yeah, for those that are having trouble following it, basically, Baral makes your Forbid 1 cheaper, which is nice, but not necessarily essential. And you can discard 2 cards to buy back Forbid. It's a 3-mana, it's a cancel you can buy back by discarding 2. And he also had Life from the Loam, so he was just discarding some lands, Life from Loaming them back, going up 1 land every time he brought them back, and just hitting every single land drop and having 1 counterspell up every single turn, while also looting through his deck with Baral, being able to trigger the Dredge with Baral's trigger to get back to Life from the Loam without even taking up his draw step. Quite disgusting, and not a thing I've ever heard of anybody doing, and that's the beauty of Cube.
It was wonderful, and I will always be grateful to Parker for showcasing that. But yeah, I think Yorion is... I like it because it's a really nice top end to build towards in a fair deck, and that can be a white fair deck or a blue fair deck, and that's the joy of hybrid cards. But also, if you want to chase the stretch goal of having it as a companion, I like to think the cube is set up in a way where you can do that, and Parker pulled it off.
And I like that Parker, I asked him after the draft, like, how was companioning Yorion? Did that work for you? And he was kind of still undecided, which is my ideal place for someone to be if I do something new in my cube. I don't want them to be like, oh, that's broken, or like, oh, that's terrible. He was like, I don't know. It felt fine, but I don't know if it would have been better to actually run 40 and just put it in the 40. It's a good spot to be in, I think.
That's a good question. I feel like I took lands pretty highly in that draft, and also maybe switch colors a little bit in the first pack. So to me, it seemed like very challenging to play such a big deck. But again, I like that stretch goal of being able to really structure your draft around meeting that stretch goal.
Yeah. Having said that, I think the safe pick and probably the correct pick is just the Misty Rainforest. And this is the tension I always come back to with the fetch lands, is they enable so much and they're so versatile, and they add so many more dimensions than if that was just a Botanical Sanctum or some replacement level Simic fixing land. At the same time, I kind of want people to be taking spells in their first pack and chasing that dream, or seeing which color they want to end up in, and not really being able to hedge their bets in that way with the fetch land, which, I think they are generally overrated in the context of like legacy cubes, vintage cubes that you see on Magic Online, but still probably head and shoulders above the average first pick in most cubes.
It's interesting. I'm curious what your thought is. Andy's actually recently updated his cube to include multiple cycles of the fetch lands, and I think
it's only been about 2 years, but sure, we can go with recently.
We'll go
Time's
with
an illusion.
Time in corrected time. That was yesterday. And interestingly, that does have this sort of effect of you don't take them as highly. So I feel like that's a little bit counterintuitive, that actually making them more prevalent can make them force people to actually do the thing you're saying and take spells. Is that something you'd consider in this environment or similar environments?
Yeah, that is effectively what I do. And I also have the full cycle of 10 triumphs as well. So that means that taking any fetch land can, in theory, be a gateway to any other color, depending on what comes down in later picks.
I think the Misty Rainforest is definitely the safe pick. I do think Skullclamp has a higher ceiling, and I think taking it here and committing to building around it is a totally reasonable plan as well. If I were actually drafting this cube with you all, I would take the Misty, because I would be playing it safe. I don't want to be... I'd be afraid of drafting the Skullclamp and then doing a bad job playing with it and looking like an idiot.
That's a really important thing when you're playing cube, is to try not to look like an idiot.
Yeah, it's very important. Anthony, what is it going to be at the end of the day for you? I think
I'm on the Misty as well.
All right, we got 3 Misties over here. Fetch lands, boring and good. You heard it here first. If you want to have a pack from your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, check out the link in the show notes to submit your cube through a form on our website. This is the last time I'm going to say it. It's been like 3 weeks in a row now. But if you've submitted a cube in the past via email that we did not read on the show, resubmit it through that form, because email bankruptcy. I'm done. I can't keep up. So that's the last time I'm going to mention that, though. In the future, I'm just going to mention the form and go from there. Dom, I'm curious to hear more about your perspective just as a competitive constructed player. We've never had a competitive player on the show before who's grinded competitive events and checks the weekly drops from Wizards of the Coast for all the best decks in a particular constructed format, all the top performers in the leagues and whatnot. And I'm curious for you just to tell a little bit about like how you got into constructed Magic, how you started playing it competitively, and what that experience has been like for you.
It's really been a feature of how I engaged with the game from the outset. So I started playing back in 2005. Saviors of Kamigawa was actually my first set, which was a tough one to introduce me to Magic. But once I survived that, I was obviously hooked. And it was only uphill from there. And then the next set was Ravnica. So, fell in love and have been here for 17 years since then. But even from that point, I knew I didn't know anything about the game yet. And I wanted to fix that. So I just devoured everything I could. And there was some, casual content out there at the time, and still a lot of ways to engage with the game back then. This was before Commander was even a word that people knew at that point. But I was always more focused on the competitive side of the game. And even though I enjoyed doing my own thing and engaging with that in a creative way, it was always with the goal of optimizing within these given constraints for any particular format. And so I've been around for long enough now that I have all of these vague recollections of decks from back in the past, from when I started playing, and if some new concept comes up, whether it's in a constructed context, or a cube context, it's easier for me to kind of build those bridges in my head and jump between one area to the next. And so that's where a lot of my both cube inspiration and constructed inspiration comes from, is if I'm engaging with a new problem, wherever it comes up, then there's a lot of stuff to analogize from in the past. And I think that's how most people learn and engage with new problems, is just by drawing some kind of inspiration from problems which are kind of related, but not really, and seeing how those building blocks can fit together.
Are you fundamentally competitive in other aspects of life? Is that part of what you consider like your personality? Do you always like to optimize things, or is Magic unique in that sense for you?
Not really, but I like having an outlet where I can do that. And so Magic is that, but it's also, it's a competitive outlet, but also a collaborative outlet. Like, it's a good way to meet people and to kind of work on shared problems together and refine your skills at that, as corporate as that sounds in a way. But I think it's good to have a healthy balance of both of those, and I wouldn't want to take this maximizing mentality to every aspect of life, but also I think it's good to have an area where you can do that and to compartmentalize in that sense.
Yeah, and then you don't have to like min-max your grocery shopping or whatever because you've got that compartmentalized in your Magic life.
I mean, you could rope me into some couponing or whatever every now and then, but yeah,
organizing your grocery list by the layout of the grocery store.
Oh, yeah, speed running through the sort of like supermarket sweep style.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then when did you get into Cube? So you've been playing since 2005. When did Cube become a thing that was in your orbit?
I want to say in late 2000s, early 2010s. And this was at a point where Cube existed and it was a thing, but there just wasn't as much Cube content. So I remember listening to very early episodes of The Third Power in like my university library, for example, and stuff like that. But if you wanted to find good discussion on the internet, there was some, but not that much. And I feel like we are almost blessed now and don't consider enough how blessed we are to have all of this information readily available, where it's almost too much. There's this information overload, and you really have to be quick in kind of identifying good information sources and dismissing the ones that are just white noise. That's more true for constructed, I think, or for some kind of competitive focus than it is for Cube. That's where the distinction is especially stark. Like when I got into the game, I would read everything I could, and this would be my daily routine. As I would wake up and I'd read all the articles on SCG and some of the other sites before school, and I might be late for school sometimes, but it was fine. I could do that. I could read everything.
Say, I've finished the internet.
Right.
I've done it all.
Now there are more articles than you could ever possibly hope to read, and a lot of them I think, frankly, don't really need to exist. And then on top of that, you have podcasts, YouTube. I'm sure Magic TikTok is now a thing as well. Twitch. There's just so many ways to immerse yourself in the game that you have to be more selective than you did 17 years ago.
Yeah, it's gotten in some ways it's a low barrier entry to making content, right? People just, record themselves playing a Magic Online League and post it to YouTube, and there's, hundreds of people that do that most days. And so knowing how to like filter through things. And I imagine this is especially important in constructed because, Cube, we're not optimizing anything except for our fun. And so, it's not like you could be misled really necessarily by a source of information, but in constructed, if you're like trying to spend your time as efficiently as possible in terms of keeping up with the metagame or staying on top of what's competitive, listening to somebody that's ill-informed or just kind of speculating could actually like lead you down the wrong path.
And I think in Cube there is a section of that fandom, if you like, that does treat it as this min-maxing problem with an objective answer, where you will see a lot of Cube content that is effectively, here are the top X cards from the new set, here are the most powerful Y cards in this color. And I think often that is the least interesting form of Cube content, because firstly, if it has an objective answer, then almost anyone could write that same article, and maybe they would shuffle a few things around on their list, but you're kind of working towards the same endpoint. And also, I think that Cube is such a uniquely good vehicle for self-expression that's part of what draws me in and keeps me thinking about it, frankly, more than I do about any other aspect of Magic on a day-to-day basis.
Even more than Modern, which you have a whole podcast dedicated to.
Or even in 2019, where I was playing these SCG Opens and these tournaments every other weekend, for the most part. Even then, most of my mental headspace that was devoted to Magic was going towards, I could support this theme in one of these cubes or what have you. It's almost heartbreaking for me to see someone post their list for review and someone will suggest, okay, here are the 40 weakest cards that you should cut. And I look at those lists and think, thank you for reminding me of all of these sweet cube cards that I could put in a list.
Fun cards from Magic's history that are not just the same 80 cards that almost everybody with a legacy-ish cube is running.
Absolutely. But I think a lot of people, when they are building their cubes and putting their personal touch on it, some of that is inspired by their own memory or history of constructed from years past. So a lot of the time you see a cube where some cards stand out, which maybe by modern standards have not aged well, or compared to the rest of the power band in the cube, don't seem like they really fit in. And you can almost reverse engineer that, okay, yeah, I would not have put Exalted Angel in this cube, but I can tell this person really enjoyed unmorphing their Exalted Angel 20 years ago.
Yeah,
right.
And that's good. And they should keep Exalted Angel in their cube, because that's what gets them going, even if it doesn't for me.
That's such a powerful idea. I love the idea of just looking at a cube and seeing these things that seem a little bit offbeat, and actually not saying cutting those, but do the opposite and say, why is this here? What is sparking joy about these for you? And let's
Obviously,
figure
it's because
out.
this person is garbage at card evaluation, Anthony. They don't even know what's good.
But I think, focusing on just rephrasing the question of what is it about these offbeat things, and can we make this more about that and actually celebrate that experience? And I totally have that experience as well, where there are power outliers in my cube in both directions, where it's literally like, one of the first drafts I ever 3-0'd involved this card, and so it makes me smile every time I see it in a way that another card won't.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that other people can't have a view on those cards. So if I see a cube where there's just an Oko in there for no good reason, and someone defends it on the grounds that, I enjoyed winning a lot in Standard with Oko. Well, I'm sure you did, but let's be serious about this. But I think if those cards have a kind of resonance to them, and often when we talk about iconic cards, they were iconic because people enjoy playing with them in God knows when. Like Psychotog, great example, right? Like I would love to find an excuse to put Psychotog in my cube. I can't do it personally, but if someone does, I'd give them a round of applause because people love Psychotog. I love Psychotog.
It's a cool card.
Yeah.
Fundamentally cool card.
I'm writing down Psychotog.
Yeah. And so I think those personal touches are what really can make cube special, along with all the other things. I had this philosophical quandary about this the other day, where one of my friends had really enjoyed the Powered Synergy Cube that a friend of the show, Caleb Gannon, had got to put on Magic Online. And so he just made his own paper copy of that cube. He just went to NPC, went to the printer, what have you, and obtained
Kinko's.
Yes, and obtained his own copy. And so at that point, that is one of the most unique and offbeat and frankly personal cubes that I've ever come across. And so if someone else likes it enough that they just rebuild it in exactly the same way, what does that say in an artistic sense, right? Like, is that their own personal cube at that point? Have they... I don't know. I don't know how to frame that thought.
I've learned from making this show that there are a lot of people that like to play cube, and the design exercise is not particularly interesting to them, or they don't have time, or just they're not drawn to it. And so I've gotten tons of emails from people specifically that have proxied the entire Degenerate Microcube because it's small. You can fit that on fewer pages down at Kinko's. And, I wrote that giant article. There was clearly a lot of time put into it. And I love seeing that. I think it's so great. And I always tell everybody that sends me this thing, like, awesome. If you make any changes, like, email me. I want to know what you took out, why, and what you added in and why. I know everyone takes that in Snaring Bridge. That could be a whole other conversation for later. But yeah, I love seeing that. And I encourage people always to kind of take it their own direction and see if they make any changes to it. But also just if people want to just play the cube, and that's the only way to do it because it's not on Magic Online, never will be, then great, print it out.
Yeah, I mean, if we could dial that into about a 7-to-1 ratio of people that just want to play cube and people that want to design cubes, that would be ideal there.
That is the golden ratio in Magic. I love this idea of thinking of a cube as like a personal history. And looking at any of my own cubes, I can definitely for sure say, like, these two cards are here because of this Bosch and Roll video I watched, and I was like, this is awesome. I love this interaction. I want to sort of chase this. This card is here because I, want to draft with it. This card is here because I saw someone else in someone else's cube play this thing, and I really enjoyed it. Like, it is definitely this, like, kind of magpie collection of just all the things that have fascinated and thrilled me about Magic kind of jammed under one roof, which is the most beautiful way to think about it, I think.
Yeah, for some players, it's their own like personal scoreboard as well. Whereas these are all the cards that I won the most with, and I try to, if I have a finish I'm proud of with a deck, or there's a deck from Constructed I especially enjoy playing, I will try and incorporate elements of that into the cube somehow, just for the personal dopamine rush that comes when I see that card in a pack and the memories that come with it. Easier in some cases than it is in others. In Modern, for a while, I was playing this like Whir Prison deck where I don't know if I want the Ensnaring Bridge experience in this cube as opposed to the Degenerate Microcube.
It's a very particular experience, the Ensnaring Bridge experience.
But I try to get some stuff in there where I can, yeah.
To that point, so you mentioned that you are known for playing Amulet Titan. For those that don't know, Amulet Titan is a combo deck that uses Primeval Titan, Amulet of Vigor, and Ravnica Bounce lands in order to generate a bunch of mana and just kind of go huge very, very quickly. The interaction there is that Amulet of Vigor doesn't say your lands come into play untapped if they would come into play tapped. It's a triggered ability that actually untaps the land. So if you have 2 Amulet of Vigors in play and you play 1 Ravnica Bounce land, then you get to untap it twice and make 4 mana. And imagine this in combination with Primeval Titan, you get to go huge. Anything else you want to say about how the deck works, just for people that maybe haven't seen it before?
Yeah, I guess to ground it in the bounce land. So I think people are really familiar with these. These are, you could call them fairly, I think, iconic cards from back in the day. And they are incredibly powerful, but they have these two inbuilt drawbacks. So they come into play tapped, and they force you to return a land to your hand. And the idea of this deck is effectively to turn each of those drawbacks in various contexts into an advantage. So you're untapping it with Amulet of Vigor, and then with returning the lands, you can have the land return itself. And so if you have these effects that allow you to make additional land drops in a turn, one bounce land can be replayed over and over again, which if you have the amulet can then generate even more mana. And so you can kind of go off from there. It's a deck which is hard to categorize simply, which is part of why it's been so engaging for me and why I've stuck with it. Whereas if it's a deck which you could give this one sentence elevator pitch for, I don't know if I would have had the same, my attention would have moved elsewhere perhaps.
Right, there's this kind of core engine at the center of it, but then there's lots of different ways you can actually take that resource you're building and do different things with it. Like, I don't think Amulet Titan decks are still playing like Sunhome, Fortress of the Legion, though I've seen lists in the past that were playing that to, give your Primeval Titan haste and then, go to town.
There are lots of weird and wacky lands that have found their way in as these toolbox targets every now and then, but that's a great example of a deck which I'm not sure how I would translate any part of that really into the cube experience outside of the general concept of maybe you have Exploration and Oracle of Moldiah and you have some bounce lands in your cube, and that's a rough approximation, but it doesn't really capture the essence of the deck, and
that doesn't have that explosiveness.
Yeah, and that's because the namesake cards just don't really function unless they are 4-ofs in a deck which is built around finding them and leveraging them to their highest potential. If you have just Amulet of Vigor in a cube pack, well, that is going 15th pick and it's ending up in everyone's sideboard, even though in the right context it's an incredibly powerful card. Ditto with Primeval Titan, actually. I think that this is an opinion which I hate to have to say, but I think that this is one of the most overrated cards in like the stock, legacy, or vintage cubes, because when you're not doing anything actively busted with it, then it just pales into comparison to all of the other 6 drops, 7 drops in green that you could work towards instead.
Yeah, it's funny. My personal journey with Primeval Titan is that it was in the first version of my cube because at the time, my cube was heavily inspired by the Magic Online cubes. Everyone was like, this is the world's best green 6-drop. You have to put it in your cube. And I was like, fine, I'll put the best 6-drop in my cube. Whatever, I'll do that. And I eventually cut it because I was like, this is basically playing as like Carnage Tyrant ++, right? Not Carnage Tyrant.
Colossal Dreadmaw.
This is basically playing as Colossal Dreadmaw ++, right? Where it's primarily just a 6/6 trampler. It gets a couple lands, but I didn't have any combo-oriented lands. I didn't have super high value targets for it.
Yeah, ramping once you were already to 6 wasn't really relevant in that context.
Right, so I cut it for a long time and swapped it out for other ramp targets, and then my cube evolved even more, and I ended up cutting almost all of my top end from green, period, and just keeping a couple like signpost cards where it's like, if you do want to go huge, you can still do the Creative Behemoth thing, but if you don't want to, the mid-range green players sideboard isn't clogged up with like 6 and 7 drops they would never be able to cast. And then I eventually got around to like really adding kind of a lands package, doubling up on fetch lands. And once I did that, now I feel like Primeval Titan actually is a good target in my cube again, because I do have the kind of environment where you can go get 2 fetch lands with your Titania in play and make an enormous army, or you can go get your Field of the Dead. Field of the Dead is really the big one. I mean, Field of the Dead is huge with Primeval Titan.
When Primeval Titan is also a Grave Titan, that feels pretty good.
Yeah, when it does both, that's a good place to be. And so now that I think have the support for it, I've come back around. It's like, actually, now this is a Carven's Red for my cube again, even though my cube is totally different, and it was cut for not being good enough, and then now it's being added back in for being overlooked for actually being quite good again, I think.
And my nod to that strategy now is trying to find ways to get at least 1 or 2 bounce lands back in my cube, because these are cards which used to be a cube staple back in the day and still are, I think, in a lot of pauper peasant cubes and so on. But once you move beyond that, it's really tough to justify taking your second turn off, often bouncing a land back to your hand with something that comes into play tapped, and then you can get punished so hard with any kind of land destruction and bounce effect and so on. You can just about justify playing a Triumph tapped on turn 1, for example, but anything after that is really tough to justify. That being said, I think there are more tools to work with now with the bounce lands than there ever have been. So you have, in my cube, the 4/10 Triumphs. You have the channel lands from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. You have the DFCs from Zendikar Rising and so on. So if you want to do cool things with bounce lands, that is easier than it ever has been, but it's also harder to justify including those in the first place than it ever has been. And so how do you square that circle? Maybe you accept that only a few people in the draft are going to want these, and that's okay. Maybe you put these in specific color combinations, and there's no obligation to play a full 10 cycle of bounce lands, right?
Yep.
So you could play Simic Growth Chamber because blue-green is the color pair which wants to land shenanigans the most.
And not
as an
Boros
example.
Garrison, because maybe your red-white deck doesn't want a tapped bounce land.
Yeah, I started with a full cycle and have cut all these sort of like more aggressive colors, bounce lands, and just I've really enjoyed that aspect of having asymmetrical land cycles.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of Golgari Signets or what have you, gathering dust in the end of Q packs in my day. But I think that there are ways to approach that problem where maybe you try and dial down the average power level of the cube to the point where something like just a bounce land showing up in a random deck is fine now and not an embarrassing choice. I think that's a much richer discussion that you can have if your goal is just what are the top 360 or 540 cards from the entire Magic lifespan, bearing in mind that my spreadsheet needs me to have 50 white cards and 50 red cards and so on down the line.
Anthony can maybe wax poetic about the bounce lands. I know you are the local bounce land enjoyer, but
I mean, everyone enjoys them. I think there are quite a few players. They're prominent in my main cube, which unfortunately we didn't get to play this weekend.
But come back so you can play Anthony's regular cube.
They are first pickable, and some players don't care about them that much, but some really enjoy them because they are extremely powerful. It's a land that says draw a card,
and I think those can be good litmus tests often for conveying the power level of an environment for someone. So
absolutely.
My saying back in the day used to be, this is a format where you can play Eternal Dragon and I pick it back up again and be happy about it. Now I think even Eternal Dragon has is gone into a happy retirement. Timeless Dragon is the new kid on the block that I really enjoy playing with. But I think that when you have these cards which maybe are marginal in terms of power level or like raw potential or anything like that, that can be a good way to give a mission statement for your cube is, okay, Simic Growth Chamber is in this cube, and I'm happy to draft it. And that maybe tells you more than a long and extensive cube primer, which you should still make and people should still read. But if someone's just showing up for Cube Night, then this is a good way to summarize all of that.
Yeah, I think having a couple like benchmark cards or sort of benchmark experiences and like the kind of tempo that you're expecting is definitely a compelling way to explain the sort of overview of a cube.
I feel like the bounce lands are such a great little case study in just why Magic is so great, right? Like, it's a relatively simple effect on this card, and there's so many aspects and so many cards it interacts with in Magic's history that you can like totally change what this card does just by putting it in different contexts. I know I originally had the bounce lands in my cube, again, because it was like the fixing I could afford, and also people said they were good, so I put them in. And eventually I was like, tap lands. I'm off tap lands. I'm trying to get as much untap fixing as I can. Then at some point I was like, this is a land that draws a card. That's extremely good. And, then you start to look at it in that light and you're like, is this one of the better tap lands in all of Magic? Like, is this like compete with the creature lands or the triomes in terms of just raw value because it draws a card? And then you realize that not being able to play your tap land on turn one is actually kind of a huge cost because that's the turn you most want to be playing your tap land anyway. And so the fact that you can't makes it worse than a tap land in that regard. And there's just all these layers of things to unpack to try and understand exactly where this card sits in Magic's pantheon of effects.
And there are more layers to that too. So if you have a cube, for example, where the curve is clustered at, let's say, the 2-drop start, which I think maybe this is a topic you can come back to. I think that is really the benchmark nowadays for what sets the pacing of a cube. Then maybe it's fine to expect to cast a 2-drop on turn 2, and then on turn 3, cast another 2-drop and play your bounce land, and then set up for the following turns. If you expect to be curving 2 into 3 in most games, then you kind of need that to keep up with everything that's going on. At that point, it becomes really hard to find a good spot in the game to just play your bounce land and take that turn off.
And then, do you keep your 2-land hand where one is a bounce land in your deck?
The
We are
thing.
hoping to curve 2-drop into bounce land on turn 3. Are you gonna lean into that, or are you gonna get punished?
I think my favorite use I found for bounce lands was as a discard outlet in like reanimated decks or decks that cared about the graveyard, where
Just play it on turn 2, pitch your Grizzlebrand.
At one point, I had Rakdos Carnarium, the black-red bounce land, in my cube, because even though black-red itself was more of an aggressive color pair and didn't seem like, if you were ranking all of the color combinations in terms of which one would want a bounce land, this would not be near the top of the list. However, for the reanimated decks, where your black reanimated cards need just a way to get your big thing in the graveyard, and in red you have a lot of these like looting style effects, discard outlets, well, being able to just buy back something to your hand and still develop was actually a pretty big benefit in that context. So even though in each of these narrow aspects the card wasn't really worth it, when you take this holistic view of the color combination, it actually filled this very niche role, which it was perfect in.
Beautiful. I love cubes so much.
I feel like I could do 3 more topics on bounce lands. Maybe we need to do a whole episode on them.
Dom, do you think you can like summarize your approach to cube design? Is there some like concise way you think about cube that you think is unique from other people? Like, how do you approach cube as a format, given that you've been thinking about it so much for so many years?
I don't have any especially unique approach. I think I mostly just ask myself, what are my goals here? What kind of play experience do I want my players to have? What kind of goals do I want to be worth chasing within the draft and within gameplay and so on, and try and work towards those, as opposed to, I think a lot of players, and this is a valid approach, but I think a lot of them go the other way, whereas like these are the best cards, or here is the cube, and then we will see what comes from that, as opposed to this is what I want the cube draft and the cube games to look like, and what do I need to put in place to make that happen. So it's kind of a more systematic approach in that sense, but it is also riddled with my own personal, pet cards and so on. And like I like to have my cube be something that says something about me in terms of these are cards that I enjoy playing with or have some history with, and it's also a testament to the game in the sense of these are cards which 17 years ago were the cream of the crop and you were excited to play with, and maybe they haven't aged so well in the most ruthless sense, but people love these cards and they're right to love these cards, and so you get to love these cards here, and this is a safe space almost to enjoy loving those cards.
And you get to explain why Akroma used to be broken, actually. Unmorphing this Akroma was a huge problem, and now it's a card no one ever looks at anymore.
Right. It always strikes me as weird that so Time Spiral was not long after I began playing. It was the year after, and at that point this was 13 years in. This was this self-referential love letter to the game itself, and now that is in the first half of cube sets. Like that is Time Spiral itself is part of Magic's ancient history, and it's just wild to think about now.
It is. It's time is not nice. I don't like thinking about time. How do you think your experience as a constructed player informs or doesn't inform your thinking about cube? Do you see people saying things about cube that you think your experience as a constructed player gives you a different perspective on?
Yeah, so going down the list, and this might jump back and forth a bit. So one thing that really is apparent when you try to min-max in a constructed context is there are a lot of formats which exist in this state of they're kind of quantum formats. So once you perceive them, the nature of those formats changes. Mm-hmm. So back in the day, this used to be the case with Legacy, for instance, where there was a really die-hard Legacy fan base that was small but vocal, and whenever the Legacy GP would come on the calendar for the year, there was this debate of, well, yeah, the pros think they know everything, and maybe that's true in Standard or Booster Draft, God forbid, but they don't know Legacy. They're going to come in here and get eaten alive. And then usually what happened at the Legacy tournaments was a handful of the Legacy experts who were just good Magic players on the whole did well, but mostly it was the pros who were good at Magic who came into Legacy and within their 2 weeks of preparation had already got themselves to that level that the community considered themselves to be on. There are formats like that now, so a lot of the kind of casual competitive formats, pre-modern would be a good example. So this is a format which encompasses sets from somewhere in 94, 95 up until Scourge, so everything that came before the 8th edition frame change, with a carefully curated ban list and so on. And I really enjoy playing that format. There's a lot to love in there, and
I enjoy looking at that format. I love looking at deck lists. I've never actually played a game in my life, but I think it's really cool to look at how the meta of that format has shaken out.
The deck lists are fun to look at, and the decks are fun to look at too. You have people who have these amazing collections from back in the day who now devote that into building pre-modern decks, and so you see fully foiled out Enchantress or whatever. It's gorgeous. It's amazing to look at. But it's a format where I don't know how much of its current stability just comes from the fact that there's not too much attention on it.
Sure.
And if you had
would it just break if there was a $20,000 payout pre-modern tournament with a bunch of pros showing up to it?
Yeah, if you had the pre-modern Pro Tour, I don't know if pre-modern would survive that. It might be the worst thing that ever happened to it. So there are formats where the format as it exists kind of in people's minds, and then the format as it could exist once it was fully optimized. And so in a cube context, depending on your play group, of course, you might have a mix of people who are like the hardcore spikes who are just blowing off some steam by playing cube, and you might have people for whom cube is their primary form of playing Magic and who take a more casual approach to it. And ideally you want your cube to serve both of those audiences. And so if you could have power outliers in the cube which are inoffensive because people either don't recognize them as such, or they're not using those to their full potential, or what have you. But then if the spike who's in the group sees those, they see blood in the water, and they pounce, and they build some deck which demolishes everyone else, and they easily go 3-0, and then now new questions are being raised about, like, do I need to do stuff to rebalance my cube? So with constructed formats, and you can see this over time, often they seem more diverse than they are at first, and then they quickly condense once people find the right thing to be doing, and then sometimes open up a little bit again once some response to that is found that can introduce a new element to it. So I think being aware of that, there's not a direct parallel you can draw with Cube where you are omnipotent, right? You get to decide what is in there, and you are Wizard of the Coast. You are R&D. You can rebalance it however you want, and there's no constraints on your ability to do that. But it's something that's just worth keeping in mind, and it's a good dynamic to be aware of.
It does make me realize that, as much as we said before that your cube is kind of a personal history of your like experience with the game, I think whether intentionally or not, it's also kind of the story of the people that play that cube. It's kind of a story of the play group because, we spend a lot of time in online cube circles, and whenever I talk about my cube in these online circles with people that haven't played it before, there's a certain set of cards people will call out and say, like, this seems like it's too good, this seems like it's too bad. And when I play it in paper with my actual play group, a totally different set of cards gets groans or, gets praise. Right now, a couple of people in the play group are really high on Rabbit Battery. They're like, this card is actually sick. I'm so excited it's in here. It does such cool stuff. And that's a card people often are like, why are you playing this card? Like, I'm looking at your Eternal Cube, and it's full of the most powerful cards in Magic's history. Now you got Rabbit Battery in here. Like, what's that doing here? Similarly, our play group somehow complains about Smuggler's Copter all the time, which...
Really? I don't know if I've ever heard that.
People are always grunting about Smuggler's Copter. I mean, I think it's the kind of card that is annoying to lose to when you're holding like a sorcery speed removal spell in your hand and you're true. I could remove anything but this right now, and that's kind of frustrating. And it is very powerful, I think, but I never see anybody call out Smuggler's Copter as like a power outlier in my list when I'm talking about it online. And so in that way, I think for sure the feedback you get from your group is going to influence how you like curate the cube. And so it's a story of you as a designer. It's also a story of the people that play that cube in your actual play group.
You're kind of filling me with fear a little bit. Like I think it's such an interesting aspect. Fear? Yeah, about how just, the people that are participating inform what the environment looks like as much as the cards that are in it. And on this very, very, very tiny scale, bringing my cube to CubeCon, that's mostly been played with a dozen or so people regularly. And I'm just so curious if people are going to break it. And after the first couple drafts, they're going to say, this is the only deck to draft, and that's it. But we'll see.
Although, if you take it to CubeCon and the more experienced drafters there find some kind of weakness there or some imbalance, and then you take it back home and your regular playgroup is still doing their same thing and they're enjoying it, they're having a good time, I don't know if that's a problem necessarily.
Totally, yeah.
So to bring in a constructed parallel here, Modern is effectively two different formats for the most part. You have Modern as it exists in a cutthroat competitive context, and then you have Modern as it exists at the LGS level or the more casual level. And you need that second form of Modern to exist for the first one to be sustainable, I think, because Modern in its most hardcore sense has often been a pretty bad format. Like it's been, I enjoy, the 2 weeks where you could cascade into Valky and that deck was horrifically busted, or you can just look at the Modern ban list and it's this laundry list of cards which they had their day in the sun, and that day lasted for exactly 1 day, and then we moved on to other things. And
that was one of my favorite things to do when I first got more serious about Magic, was like look at a ban list and then be like, why is Summer Bloom on this list? Let me Google Modern Summer Bloom and look at some old Summer Bloom lists in Modern and see what the problem was with this card. And yeah, the ban lists really tell a story of like a series of decks that have been problems over the years that are interesting perspective on different formats.
Yeah, so if you have to play that constantly cycling version of Modern over and over again, I don't know if you can convince people to buy into that for the long term or to show up to their tournaments every week. But the form of Modern that exists at a lower level where people can show up with what would now be called Boomer John or what have you, right? Like the John deck that often they've lovingly foiled out over the past decade or what have you. Like they can still...
And now just get stomped on by Solitude.
Well, in some cases, but if they go to their store and other people are also playing decks which they're playing mostly because they enjoy and which are like tier 2-ish in a more rational sense, not to carry any connotations with that, then if there is a lot of like John versus Soul Sisters at your LGS, like that is a form of Modern that exists, and that is the form of Modern that has vaulted that to become the most popular like competitive constructed format.
Yeah.
And so you could draw the parallel to Cube there, where if there is this hypothetical world in which these min-maxes solve your cube, but the world that you actually live in and host people for every week, it seems fair and balanced, then that's okay. That world is the one that you live in.
That's something I'm always saying too, is that I feel like a lot of cube designers are trying to design their cube in like a vacuum. They want to know, like, if you sat down with 10,000 different Magic players and they each did 10,000 drafts, like I want to balance my cube so that at the end of all of that, the color pairs are equally represented and every strategy is viable or whatever. But the reality is, like, that's never going to happen. You're never playing your cube that way. So, like, if you have a local play group and it's working well and in that meta, things are playing the way you want them to, don't sweat somebody that says, hey, objectively looking at your list, this card is broken, this strategy is too good. I mean, another example from my own cube is I think Balance is one of the best cards in my cube. I get it every single draft. No one takes that card in my cube. I wheel it all the time. And to everyone else's credit, I have yet to have a draft where I, like, totally annihilated everybody and made them groan about Balance. And so... yeah, is it too good for my cube? Maybe. Has it ever been a problem in my local playgroup? It hasn't. And so I just keep doing it, you know?
I think balance is actually the perfect cube card for a higher power level where
it's one of the reasons I built a cube in the first place was literally to play the card balance.
The ceiling is absurdly high on that card, and I don't want to say why it doesn't have interesting cards, but it doesn't have cards that really like make your eyes light up and you're excited to dig into them the way you are with balance. And it's a card which, not to read too much into the name, but it does get you out from behind more so than pushing your advantage once you're ahead. And this is a recurring issue, especially in modern Magic design. I think it's so easy for these cards that do everything everywhere all at once to just snowball, and you play one of those on turn 2, one of those on turn 3, and if you're on the play, often it's really hard to actually come back from that in a meaningful way. Balance does that, and it does it in a way that actually can really flip the game in your favor. So having that potential for that sudden reversal in a cube, I think that's what leads to these really memorable moments. So yeah, even if, strictly speaking, once again, balance it doesn't do that consistently enough to be worth it, the fact that it can do it at all and do it decently well enough of the time, perfect cube card.
Yeah, I love it in my environment for exactly that reason. And I think it's fun to try and make people like, we all know it's broken, right? We all know that it's a problem and it shouldn't be printed. Now draft a deck to prove that, right? Like actually like bear that out with actual Magic play. I also think it's, so I've been listening to your podcast, Dom and Arias Judgment, and it always strikes me because I am a passing spectator of Modern, right? Like I watch some streams or I watch some YouTube videos or listen to your podcast, but I have not sleeved up a Modern deck in years and years and years. And when I last did, it was blue-black fairies when that was a tier 2.5 list, 5 years ago. But I was always struck by the fact that, like, for example, you were always looking at the Magic Online results every week, and there are league results, and I don't actually know Magic Online that well. Leagues are things you can just enter anytime, right? There's just always leagues running. And then there's also every week a challenge, which is like considered the more competitive event. Maybe it's a higher entry fee, bigger payout, and it's only one a week. And you've even talked about the difference in just the meta between the Modern leagues and the Modern challenge, which is like all on Magic Online, but the people that enter leagues are inherently a little bit more casual. The people that are like waiting for the challenge every week are a little more spiky, and that leads to like a different meta even in those two very slightly different contexts.
Yeah, the structure of that show, and it's a conscious choice, is that we start with going over the results from the most recent tournaments, usually Modern, but sometimes other formats too, and then we end the show with our Nonsense of the Week segment. And so this is just the weirdest and wackiest stuff that was showing up in the leagues and sometimes in those tournaments, and that's perfect when you get that crossover.
Power Conduit, 5 O's in Modern, turns out.
I won one of the first Modern challenges after MH2 came out, the first weekend, with a Power Conduit in my Urza Target deck. So that's just that's a crowning achievement for me personally. But I don't think the show could really exist and be sustainable unless we had the ability to go over the competitive results at the start and then go over the nonsense of the week at the end. I think both of those are essential to making it what it is, and you can draw the lessons there for Cube as well. I think it's really hard to find anything that ports directly over to Cube from Constructed. So you think the most popular Constructed format, taking the term broadly, is Commander, right? Where it's multiplayer.
Yeah, for sure.
Enough different rules that it's effectively a different game engine or a different game, and also regulated by these social norms that exist in Commander, which, even though Cube is meant to be a casual format as well, there's this understanding there that, well, one person is providing us this shared experience, and hey, if you think there's too wide a power band or you're sick of losing to Smuggler's Copter, you can just complain to Andy and it's fine. There's no personal grievance with each other. So that can be a source of inspiration, and there are definitely people who have Commander cubes heavily informed by both of those formats.
Right.
But if you're trying to build a more conventional cube, it's really tough to find inspiration there. And in my experience, the most frustrating aspect there is the color identity system, where if I'm trying to find stuff which works really well in like a Jund Sacrifice deck, I can go on EDH Rec.
It's got a hybrid blue mana cost, so it's right out.
I can look up the latest black-red Sacrifice-themed Commander of choice, and all of the cards that are clustered in with it are going to be black-red cards because you're not allowed to play green cards in your deck for some reason. That's a debate for another time. But so that can be a source of inspiration, but not really. And that statement is true of everything else as well. Like I was recently looking up old Tiny Leaders deck lists because this is the format.
Because you're a sicko, you're a true freak.
Well, sure, but also because it kind of mirrors Cube in the sense that you actually need to have a mana curve, and that is enforced upon you by the rules of the format in a way that conventional Commander is often about just dirtling around until you cast your 6 drops and your 7 drops and so on. And also it's 60 cards, it's singleton, so that you can see the parallels starting to develop. But beyond that, if I have a personal favorite Modern deck, in Amulet Titan, let's say, I can't just port that to cube because it literally doesn't work. Like, this relies on, I have 4 pieces of my namesake card A and namesake card B and enough tools in between to make those work. And I guess you could build a cube from the ground up around that, but not easily, and to the exclusion of everything else.
Right. If you did, it's going to be the Amulet Titan cube. It's not going to be a regular cube where you can sometimes draft Amulet Titan if you want.
Yeah. Whereas I think what you can do is draw inspiration across years and formats for more generic archetypes. So if I'm thinking, what should a blue-eye control deck look like in my cube? Well, if you have the entire 30 years of card designs to look at from first principles, that's pretty overwhelming. It can be hard to actually know where to get started there. But if you take a blue-eye control deck from the most recent standard or the last modern challenge, those give you a rough template to work from. And then you can compare and contrast those with, let's say, blue-eye control from the draw go days in the late 90s, where planeswalkers didn't exist yet, creatures were effectively unplayable in control decks, and so it was 20 counterspells and some sweepers and some card draw, and that's how we built our control decks back then. Or you then fast forward to the era where I started playing, where they had just about recognized that, okay, the creatures do need to play a role in this game somehow, but we're just figuring out how to do that. And you have the first generation of tap-out control decks, where these are decks which they aren't hoping to establish full control of the game, just constrict the opponent over the course of 20 turns. They're using their counter spells, they're using their removal as a bridge to turn 5, turn 6, where we play our Maloku or our Kagan. Those are 2 cards that I love to this day, and we'll find an excuse to smuggle into my cubes wherever I can. And then you flash forward to the more modern generation of control decks, where some of them are like Super Friends decks, right? And this is a pretty common template in Cube as well. You take your Planeswalkers, and as long as you can activate those every turn, that is your source of card advantage and your finisher at the same time, and you just back that up with whatever you can to keep those around.
I found myself flummoxed by the decks in like modern or standard people label as control decks these days, because it's just like 4 colors and a bunch of good spells, and it's like control, I guess, because it's not aggro, but it definitely is not recognizable to me as what I think of as control, and that gets to how these terms are also flexible and imprecise.
Yeah, and I think now, if you look at, given the history of the game, we have 15 years of Planeswalkers by now, and this new attitude to design has taken hold. I think that is what we should expect from control. And if you had a new player coming into the game looking to learn this terminology, that's what they would think of as a control deck. And those pure control decks that existed back in the 90s, where you had maybe like 1 Frenetic of Free as your win condition, or a Stalking Stones or something, that is the aberration. And if you take the broad sweep of history there.
We did have that kind of recently with Dominaria Standard, I think, back when you had the 5-color Teferi control decks that would just win by milling you out by looping their own Teferis, putting them back in their deck, which was about as dirtily as a control win condition can possibly get. But no, I think you're right. There's definitely trends overall in the cards, Wizards designs. And right now, we're definitely in a period where we are getting extremely pushed creatures, extremely pushed, value cards at 3 and 4 mana. And when's the last time we got a really pushed counterspell? I mean, I think Miscast is really pushed in very specific contexts. Force of Negation probably is one of the ones that's pretty pushed, but we don't see as many of those as we do see Omnaths and Uros and Okos.
And at the other end of that spectrum, if you look at, let's say, the red aggro decks, if you want to build one of those into your cube, at the base level, you can say, well, I'll put some 1-drops and some 2-drops, and I'll have some burn spells, and that's all well and good. That's going to be a decent cube aggro deck. But if you want
to closer to your mouth.
But if you want to be inspired by Constructed, you can look at the last 5-7 years of Standard, where it felt like every other Standard format, there was a different red deck that was at the top of the food chain.
Right.
But those red decks looked very different from each other. So you had a red deck that won a Pro Tour that was effectively 20 burn spells and some Monastery Swift Spears, some prowess creatures. And then you have the red decks from recent Standard, which were very battlefield-centric. It's, I'm going to play some creatures, get on the board, and we have this almost twin-esque top end of Anax with Torbrand and Embercleave and so on. And those are both red aggro decks, but it almost doesn't make sense to group them together outside of that. I mean, those decks, you could happily go to 5 life against them because there was literally not enough burn in the deck to get the job done at that point. So those are 2 very different models for how to build an aggro deck.
But they get the same label in the deck database, probably. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And so when you're thinking about how to build an aggro deck into your cube and what you want that to look like, well, now you have these 2 examples that you can build from that point you in very different directions.
Part of what you're saying here is it's difficult to take a specific constructed deck and say, oh, let's make exactly this work, because a lot of those decks rely on a density of like a really specific card interactions. But we can just sort of look at the through lines of what was the trend over a period or a trend over some format, and just take that sort of play style and that game plan and try and translate that into a cube. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Or if there's a deck which stands out because it was especially unique or it had this combination of cards that was hard to replicate in other formats, sometimes you can take even just that narrow combination as a starting point and build up from there. So
sort of use that as a nucleation site to sort of build a structure around.
I don't know what that means, but I will go with it. I will agree with you. So like the Rexer decks, like Recurring Nightmare, Survivor of the Fittest from back in the day, very popular constructed deck. You can put both of those cards in your cube, but what do you do from there? Well, now that we have another 20 years of cards since then, you can build on top of that with Fauna Shaman and some creature tutoring effects. And Feed Artisan looks like it would be great in this shell, right? Like it kind of does a little bit of both things. Or you could build a deck inspired by that, which, given that this is Cube in 2022 and not standard in 1998, it's going to look different, and it should, and it has to, but it can still use that as a recognizable starting point, which if you did get to play that standard deck in the day and you loved it, then some amount of that dopamine is going to flood your brain once you see these kind of Rexer adjacent cards in a cube pack near you.
I know we're going to get this question, so I have to ask it. A lot of people that I know that are pursuing more constructed-esque formats or decks in their own cube will do this sort of draft package thing. We're like, okay, you take one Collected Company, you get 3, because we all know that Collected Company is a card that if you can commit to building around it, then you can end up with a very different deck than if you just throw one into a 40-card deck and hope that it works sometimes. Have you ever considered or experimented with that for things like Amulet of Vigor or whatever to try and add the redundancy and density you need in order to actually draft a deck of that kind?
That is my current cube project, as it happens.
Oh,
so,
very exciting.
Ryan Sachs was doing a similar thing at a much higher power level. So if you go on his Twitter, you can see a lot of polls essentially saying, if you could take any card from the like legacy vintage card pool and so on and guarantee that you had 3 or 4 copies of that card in your cube deck, what would move the needle there in a way that it wouldn't if it's one copy in a singleton 40-card deck?
Right. You start looking at cards like Aethervial, where maybe that's great if you can have 3 copies, but pretty meh if you can only have 1.
Yeah, and he's really pushing the boundaries there. So he's doing things like you can build a Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation combo deck, which is pretty consistently killing on turn 3 or stuff like that. So inspired by that, I'm trying the same idea, but at a lower power level where things have more room to breathe. So, for example, in my main cube that we did a sample pack from, I have Risen Reef, I have Master of Waves. Both of those are cards which they work very well together, but individually as well, you could build a Risen Reef deck or a Blue Devotion deck centered around Master of Waves. And if you had 3 or 4 copies of each of those cards, that really changes things in terms of what you can expect from the draft and then which other cards you're taking to as a nod to those as well. So I think that concept has a lot of promise. I'm really excited to dive into that further.
I'm sure that everyone will be excited to see where you end up with that, because that's definitely very promising. Master of Waves is one of those cards that I have always loved and never found a place I could just like slot it in and have it work. It's such a cool design.
Mm-hmm. I think one other big thing that Constructed forces upon you and makes you learn is that what you can do in a format operates under certain limits. And once you find patterns in those limits, then you kind of hit the ground running, you know what to look for. So the mana obviously is a big one, where recent standard formats in particular have been very heavily defined by, we've had the triomes, we've had these other cycle of lands which are good at fixing, but not good at fixing for multiple colors for an aggro deck at the same time. So you think about Omnath in standard, where the 4-color Omnath decks somehow had better mana than the 2-color Gruul aggro decks because you didn't have a stomping ground.
Play with tap lands,
you had a Crag Crown Pathway or whatever, but that's one of 2 colors at any given time. So if you're trying to curve a double green 3-drop into a double red 4-drop, that doesn't really help you that much. Whereas if you have triomes and Fable Passage and so on, then you can easily get green, blue, white, red by turn 4, because that's the only requirement you need.
And you're not worried about going fast, because on turn 4 you're going to gain 4 life and wipe the board. So
exactly. So
you don't care what happens in the first 3 turns of the game.
Yeah. So that the takeaway from there could just be, the number of tap lands in your environment and the number of fixing lands available to a color combination really inform what you can do with that color pair, almost more so than the actual spells that you put into that color pair past a certain point. Or if you have a format which is especially fast, then you need the fixing to be plentiful and accessible enough that it keeps up with that. So one issue I have with a lot of kind of vintage cubes or cubes which are hoping to go fast is that you're trying to operate a constructed speed deck on a limited quality mana base. And there's just some tension in there, which leads to some bad gameplay a lot of the time. You could look at Pioneer as well, where one of the defining features of that format since its inception a few years ago is the enemy color fixing is so much worse than so much better, than the ally color fixing. Where if you want to build a Golgari deck, you have Blooming Marsh, you have Llanowar Waste on top of your Overgrown Tombs and your Pathways and so on. If you want to build a green-white deck, you don't have a fast land in the format yet. You are going to have a pain land soon, but not for a few months. And so that is a somewhat artificial or accidental limit on what you can do in the format.
Is that just because of where they decided to draw the line and where the format starts, and that they happen to print cycles at different times?
Yeah, the original fast lands were in Scars of Mirrodin. That's not in Pioneer. The next cycle was in Kaladesh, and that is. And that's just how we got to the place we are. But you really feel the ripple effects of that throughout the format. And if you printed Rageverse Thicket and the rest of that cycle into Pioneer, the entire format would change completely overnight. And that's just an illustration of what the mana means for your format.
Thanks to Alveric for asking basically that question we talked about for the past 45 minutes. We sought out some questions, and that is pretty much what Alveric was asking. We have one more question here, which I think is still related to all these topics, which is just, given that you have so much experience playing combo decks, how do you approach combo in a cube context?
So in terms of designing it or drafting it?
Either, I think. We don't talk about combo much on this show just because we don't really have capital C combos in either of our main cubes, right? We definitely are focusing on decks that operate in this tempo and value spectrums and are competing on similar axes. And my kind of personal definition of combo decks is some deck that kind of ignores one or both of those axes, right? It doesn't matter how much tempo or value I gain if I'm just going to play Deceiver Exarch and Splinter Twin, in back-to-back turns. The rest of the game is kind of null and void. So for that reason, we don't talk about it that much. Either way, I guess, from a design perspective or just as a player.
Yeah, so to tie it into the main topic first, if you have a combo deck that is named after a particular card, usually it's going to be hard to replicate that in a cube context. If you have a more generic archetype, so Reanimator would be an example which shows up everywhere in Constructed and also in most cubes as well. Yeah. I don't know how much of that is just not knowing what else to do with black past a certain point, but the discussion for another time, maybe.
I think there's a lot. I mean, I had Reanimator in the first version of my cube, but at some point I was like, this deck is unlike anything else that my cube is doing. I don't have any other deck that is cheating mana, that is abusing tempo in this way, where it's just putting a 8 mana creature into play on turn 2. It just felt like it was a totally different thing, and there was probably, maybe if you looked at it in the aggregate, it wasn't maybe it had a 50% win rate, right? It was not overperforming or underperforming. But the games where it won, it was oh, well, my deck can't do anything with what your deck is doing. And the games where it lost, it was I happen to have the Swords of Plowshares, and now your 3-card committed combo kind of just falls apart because you didn't have a way to protect it. It just felt like it was on a different axis than the other thing. So I also question that prevalence of Reanimator in so many cubes that I see, where there is nothing else that resembles that kind of deck. It's the only deck there that is doing a sort of combo-oriented thing.
And that can be good if your goal is to add some variety to the experience. And
if you want to have a combo deck or two, Reanimator is a pretty good one because it does have a lot of overlap with other strategies.
Yeah, maybe that's the point. Maybe this is a deck that is unlike the general playstyle you'll get in any other color combination or strategy. But the nice thing about Reanimator, I think, is that there are enough good reanimation spells up across the curve, and there's enough good reanimation targets and enablers that you can build a version of the deck that is tailored to your environment. So one thing that some people do is they consciously cap how cheap the reanimation spells are, and they start at 3 mana or 4 mana. And so that's the fundamental turn where you can expect some big dumb idiot to come into play at a discount. Versus you have the high octane vintage cubes where you're really trying
Dark
to
Ritual and Tomb Reanimate or whatever.
Yeah, Grizzlebrand is coming into play on turn 2 some amount of games, and you're going to have to live with that. I'll probably just die pretty quickly once that happens. But there's enough cool stuff going on there that you can seed whatever version of that you want, and also find tie-ins to other decks as well. So, that's going to be centered in black for the most part, but, green has its own enablers and red has its own enablers, and so does blue, but all of those function in slightly different ways. And so you can nod towards specific color pairs and so on as well. So there's a lot you can do in that space. More generally with combo, I like combo decks where you can interact with them in a way that you might interact with a more regular fair deck. So this is why I'm a big fan of creature combo decks, which I think are also more fun to play personally, and also easier to assemble in this kind of singleton environment where if you're a green-black, Yawgmoth deck or something, then you have your Yawgmoth, but you maybe also have like a Once Upon a Time or a Worldly Tutor or lots of ways to stitch that together.
Or those pieces are just not as, they do something on their own, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
if you're playing a persist combo deck or whatever, your creatures are just creatures, and maybe they're a little below rate in isolation compared to what you could be doing at that same point in the mana curve if you weren't focused on the combo, but you're not just sitting there with like part A of your AB combo in hand waiting for part B to do anything.
Yeah, and from the other side, that Source of Plowshares that's in their hand, well, they now have an interesting tactical choice of, do I point that at one of the early creatures that's ramping or applying pressure, or do I save that for this big combo piece that might be coming down in a few turns? So I think that's more fulfilling on both ends there, versus at the other extreme, I played a cube where the goal to just find anything else to do with black was to essentially have all of black's tutors stitch together these 2-card combos. So there was like the Oracle Consultation combo, and there was Leyline, Helm of Obedience, and there was a game where I got Leyline into Helm I had that played against me on turn 3, and I guess like that was successful. It did its thing. That was the idea here.
I suppose this is good.
Right, and it was, I guess, good for the opponent who fulfilled that strategy, but it felt miserable from the other side because it's like, well, I couldn't do anything about this, but in most of my games, I wouldn't have to do everything about this because, well, they just drew a Leyline in the void that does nothing against my deck. Or
right.
Here's a Helm of Obedience coming down on turn 4, and that was the least impactful card in the cube in any other context other than working with this one card.
I find that is personally, this is a personal failing of mine, but one of my biggest feel bads is when someone beats me with what I consider to be bad cards, where it's like you put a Leyline in the void in your deck and you figured out a way to beat me with it in cube. Like that does always like twist a little nerve in me where it's like, come on.
Right. And so to bookend this with the constructed discussion, Modern, as it stands right now, is a pretty good illustration of this, actually, where you have your creature combo decks, certainly, but also the combo decks that do exist for the most part have to be somewhat flexible, and they're combo control decks or they're mid-range decks with a combo finish, because if you want to build a reanimated deck in that format, there's enough good graveyard hate, enough good removal that you can't really be all in on that plan. So you have to be this fair deck with other stuff going on that becomes a combo deck at a certain point. So, Esper Reanimator, pretty cool deck in that format where you can be ephemerating your Grief or your Solitude or your Mold Drifter even. Mm-hmm. You're interacting with them, casting some removal spells, some card draw, and then at a certain point, you can persist your Archon of Cruelty and then ephemerate that, and that's a really cool big finish to work towards. So I think that's a better model for combo to exist in a format, whether that's constructed or in cube, frankly. I guess the final lesson I would say from constructed is going back to this topic of limits. There's often an interaction spell or some play pattern which really defines what you can do, and often in constructed it's one removal spell or one planeswalker often, or something that kills your thing and leaves something behind, where an entire swathe of cards is just unplayable in the face of that. So Teferi Time Raveler is a notorious example recently where if you play just a 4-drop, let's say a Kalitas or something, right? You play Kalitas, they play Teferi Time Raveler and they bounce it. You just instantly want to cut that card from your deck on the spot. It's such a devastating...
You got like Time Walk plus basically in that situation.
You have been out-tempoed, perhaps. And then also, this static ability on Teferi nullified everything that was going on the stack, where you couldn't play 3-mana counterspells really in those formats, because if your opponent has turn 3 Teferi on the play, your card literally doesn't do anything anymore. Or
enjoy your Darksteel Relic.
Or the thing that always gets me is Teferi was in the same set as Finale of Promise. Really cool card, this big flashy mythic in red that recasting spells from your graveyard, and super cool card.
And it's a sorcery, so it's not even like on its face. It seems like it would be affected by Teferi,
but
why not?
The way it's worded, it gets shut off by Teferi, and a lot of the decks in this format have Teferi, so it is illegal to put this card in your deck. You are a fool and a rube if you play this card, and that is a very common thing that happens in basically any constructed format. So even in Modern, like Unholy Heat, for example, a card which, when it was printed, there's a bunch of these more expensive cards which the virtue used to be they got around Lightning Bolt, or they dodged some of this removal, that instantly became unplayable overnight because you can't survive the most prevalent 1-mana removal spell in the format. And so most constructed formats have limiting factors like that, and in Cube, the first copy of Unholy Heat or the first Teferi Time Raveler can only damage you so much, right? So you could have a cube.
It does not make you a rube for putting Finale of Promise in your deck.
You might be a rube for other reasons, but that's you can happily have those cards coexist even in a 360 card cube and be okay with it. But those limits do still exist on some level. So when I was looking through my cube recently, I realized so many of the burn spells in my red section deal 2 damage. Unholy Heat, Blast from the Past, all of these cool shocks that have other things going on deal exactly 2 damage. And so the the break point in my format was if you have 3 toughness, it's going to be pretty hard for some of these red decks to actually kill you in the first few turns. And that could be a good thing. Maybe that's a dynamic you acknowledge and want to exist, because if you have some cool build-around creature that has 3 toughness, it's now more likely to survive. That's a good thing. On the other hand, you might think, what is the point of a red deck if its removal can't kill creatures consistently? And so you work in maybe something like a Mizium Mortars or some of these spells which maybe they only damage creatures, or there's more conditionality built into them, but they fill a hole that's left by the other interaction in the format.
And this is how you end up thinking about Cube with all of your waking hours, because it's just an endless loop of you tip 1 domino over and 4 others fall. You try and put those back up and 4 other dominoes fall.
Yeah, but that's the thing which if you're just looking at the spreadsheet and going down the line, might not jump out at you as easily. And so having that trauma, I guess, from Constructed can help to inform some of that.
Learning that because one card exists, that like dictates the playability of a bunch of other cards is a thing that like a lot of cube designers probably don't consciously think about. Like, putting these 4 different, Doomblade variants in my cube does just make these 4-drop creatures or 5-drop creatures with no inherent value a huge liability. That's true of many other more novel interactions that people perhaps think of.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You're sort of describing the same thing, but the inverse, as saying, well, it's if you're translating from Constructed to Cube, because it's often singleton and we have all these other forces at play, it's difficult to make a lot of these specific 2-card interactions, for example, work consistently. But it also means when you're facing against the table, you don't have these 2-card like invalidations happening in the same way. So it can also be a feature as much as it can be a different limitation.
It's a source of context, and that's the most broad thing you can say about it. And it can go the other way too. So Favor of the Mirror Breaker, for example, a card which I'm a massive fan of in both Constructed and Cube, but it took me and a lot of people a long time, like longer than it should have, to catch onto its power in Constructed. But I saw a few people who were early believers in that card because during the preview season, they had proxied it up 2 tests in their cubes.
Yep.
And maybe they didn't have high hopes for it, but they came away very impressed. And that can be a good guide to, hey, maybe we should try this in other formats as well.
We're going to get you to your train soon, but I do want to wrap up with, you did draft my cube last night, and at the end of a draft, I'm always asking every player, like, what'd you think? Did you have any cards in your pool you thought stood out, were too good, duds, anything you played against was really frustrating? But I intentionally didn't ask you what you thought of your draft because I wanted to capture that on air. You 3-0'd last night, you took down the win. What'd you think of the cube? Do you have any criticism for me I can take notes on?
I have no withering takedown stored up ready to go.
That would make such a good ending to the podcast, right? Though, if you just drag the shit out of me.
I can do that. Maybe that's the issue with content as a whole, right? Like that gets more eyeballs or whatever.
So many more clicks. Dom Harvey absolutely destroys casual cube designer,
and the thumbnail has you like the shot.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I really enjoyed it. I thought that it's interesting where I hear you guys talk about just Cube as a whole and your specific cubes basically every week. And so actually getting a chance to view that in action and to put that into practice, I had these expectations coming in and I would say those were met. I feel like the cube reflected the design goals that you speak about all the time and which you're working towards. And it was clear there was a level of care and intentionality put into it that I thought really came across in the drafting process and the gameplay as well. So I was happy.
Now you've gone and been all nice. Now we have a wholesome ending to the show instead of a cool
withering compliments.
Instead of a cool flash in the pan. Is there anything else you want to get in here, Anthony?
I don't think so. I'll just say thanks for coming on and thanks for coming to play Cube. It's been a great weekend.
Yeah, you're always welcome back in Baltimore. We are not that long of a plane ride away from Toronto, and we'll pick you up at the airport. Though not at Dulles. If you find at Dulles, you're on your own to get up here. But if you find BWI, we'll pick you up.
Yeah, the play group has about 34 more cubes for you to try out as well. So.
Yes, I will try not to make that specific airport mistake again. But yeah, I mean, thanks for having me. Hosting experience was fantastic. Cube experience was fantastic. Really no complaints. So honestly, this was the main appeal of the trip to me over and above just playing in a tournament or whatever. Like, this is what we came here for, and very pleased.
You're always welcome back. If you want to get more of Dom, he's got a podcast with Ari Lax called Dom and Ari's Judgment, which you can find on, I'll link it in the show notes. I'll link all the places. They're on Twitter, they're on Apple Podcasts, all the places you can possibly listen to podcasts. They also got a Patreon, so check that out if you want to support Dom's continued content creation. I've been listening to the show for a while. Mostly I just started listening because I enjoyed your cube content, and I was like, let's hear more of this person. But I like being a spectator of constructed formats as a person that is, let's say, 95% interested in cube as far as my relationship to the game. But really interesting to me to like actually just see what's going on in other formats and kind of get a peek in. And your show is great for that. And that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Dom and I, getting some coffee on the way over, walking to Anthony's house in the morning, and recording a sneaky podcast during work hours. Don't tell our boss.
Don't tell our bosses, please.